All right, welcome to our next video in the series. This is our video for Lab 13, which is called Bouncy House. This is meant to be our introduction into cloning. So we have, up until this point, worked with sprites, asked them to move around the stage. We've developed variables. We've talked about loops. We have just about every other tool at our disposal. The one thing that we don't have yet is clones. And the reason that clones are a big advantage when programming in Snap is because we've all played video games. If I had to make an individual sprite for every bad guy that appeared on the screen, that could be a real challenge, right? There are video games where you're fighting 5, 10, 50 guys. And if in Snap, if I had to make a brand new sprite for every one of those bad guys, that would be a headache to manage all of that. And the idea behind clones is we want the ability to just take one clone and duplicate it, right? To make a copy of it, which we're going to call a clone. So what does Bouncy House ask? It asks that we create a red bouncing ball that bounces around the screen. When the space bar is pressed, that ball moves in a different direction. So that's part one. Part two says, when you press B, another ball should appear on the screen. It should be a different color. It should go in a random direction and also continue to bounce around the screen. So that's the idea. It's meant to be a shorter lab. Let me show you what it looks like when it's working. So when the game starts, I don't see anything rolling around. As soon as I press B, I get a red ball and there's a yellow ball. Notice how they're all going different directions. Every time I press B, I get a new ball. It's a different color, flies around the screen. It's moving smoothly. There's nothing glitchy about the movements. I guess maybe a little bit as you add a lot of clones. And then if I hit spacebar like this, they all move in a different direction. It's worth noting, Snap can handle a pretty high number of sprites. Let's see what we're going to get up to right here. It still works pretty smoothly. But eventually, at some point, it starts to get kind of messy. If ever I need to delete all my sprites, I just hit the stop button, poof, and they all fade away. So that's what Lab 13 should look like. Let's talk about the blocks that you might need to be successful. So first, I'm going to go ahead and delete these extras that we don't need. There are 3 new blocks that we're going to care about, only 2 of which you really need for this particular lab. So the first is one that's called When I Start as a Clone. The idea is, let's say I had a sprite and I named this sprite ball. Well, whenever I execute this command, make a clone of ball, it will then execute whatever is under this hat. So when I start as a clone, maybe I go to position 00 and I say hello for 2 seconds. And so whenever I do that, then I get a clone at the middle of the screen that says, hello, there's my clone. I do it again, and I get another clone. And we can see this is how we create new objects. So your question is going to be, if you've made a ball, and that ball is bouncing around the screen, what code are you going to put when I start as a clone? So that's something to bear in mind. And then the thing that's often tricky is, how do you get all those clones to have different colors? Well, I'll recommend that you have different costumes for each of the balls in the costume tab. I think that's important. And you're probably going to use switch to costume. I know some people use next costume. I'm going to leave it at that. Use your creativity to figure out how you want to change the balls. And then if we want them all changing direction, perhaps we would use something like when space key is pressed. So this is a moment I want to go ahead and point out that any code that I put in here, any hat blocks that I put in the ball scripts are going to get heard by clones as well, which means there's usually one crime that you can commit that'll break your program, and that is if you ever ask a sprite to make a clone of itself. And let me talk about why that is. What's the danger of asking a sprite to make a clone of itself? So I'm going to delete all the clones, and I'm going to go ahead and tell these guys, you know what? When you start as a clone, perhaps go to a random position, and then I'm just going to have them go in circles. That's going to be what my clones do. So forever move 3, turn 5 degrees. This should make all of my sprites go in a circle. So let's see what this does. If I create a clone of ball, which it's not a ball right now, but there it is. There's one going in a circle. There's another one. There's another one. Let's create a clone of ball. Watch what happens if I say, whenever a space key is pressed, create a clone of myself. Well, it's no longer just the main sprite, the non-clone sprite that hears it. Now all of my clones will hear it. So you can see this little number 3 represents the number of clones there are. When I go to hit space, that number jumps to 7. When I do it again, that number jumps to 15. And the reason it went from 3 to 7 to 15 is because there was one original sprite and 3 clones. All of them made a clone. So that means we added 4 clones. So there was 3 plus 4 makes 7. So then there was an original clone and there was an original sprite and 7 clones. When we hit spacebar again, they all made clones. So then you had 8 new ones in addition to the 7 that were already there. So the next number should be 31. And the next number after this should be maybe 63. Is that right? Yeah. And so you can see it gets out of hand pretty quickly, the number of sprites that we create, and it starts to be pretty unusable. So my one word of advice before your program crashes and you lose all your work and you're sad, try to never use create a clone of myself. In fact, I think a useful tool is to put your clone creation scripts in the stage. So the stage is kind of this neutral location. The stages are restricted. There's a lot of blocks they're not allowed to access. For example, stages can never move, or they're not supposed to. There's a way to make it look like the stage is moving. So they don't have access to any motion blocks. But stages can manage variables. Stages can manage control blocks. So maybe you say something like in the stage, maybe you say when B key is pressed, create a clone of ball, something like that. And now we get the much more controlled one sprite at a time. All right, that was Lab 13. Thanks for watching.